Welcome to rSlash Nuclearrevenge, where OP describes how he murdered someone. Our first Reddit post is from Throwaway Happiness 10. And prepare yourself because this story is intense. I am now the only child from my parents, but it wasn't always the case. My dad is a spineless cuck that is dominated by my ruthless mother. When I was around 2 years old and living in Sweden, my dad went on a trip to Syria to visit my grandmother that used to live there, and stayed with her for 1 year because she had a tumor and had to get a few operations. During this year, he was a regular to a prostitute he fancied. Eventually, he got her pregnant. After giving birth, she came to my grandmother's house and just dumped her daughter on him and left. She ghosted him and he couldn't find her anymore. My grandmother called my mother and all heck broke loose. My mother ordered him to throw my sister in the dumpster and pretend she wasn't alive because she was filth. My dad was very close to doing this, but somehow, what's left of his fatherhood woke up for a second and he didn't throw my sister away. He instead convinced my grandmother to keep her, and eventually she will take care of her when she grew up. Technically, just having her as a servant. This was the most humane solution he could come up with. When I eventually grew up, I met my sister when I was visiting my grandmother and we got really close. She even looked a lot like me, so I had no doubt she was my sister. But the way she was living was just awful. It broke my heart seeing how underfed she was. Her clothes were one rip away from being rags, and she wasn't allowed to use my grandmother's combs and stuff to fix her hair. I would collect any money I got and send it her way, but my grandmother eventually found out and started taking them for herself. She was never allowed to go to school and could only see a doctor when she became seriously ill. By the time she reached 14 years old, she admitted to me that she was thinking about killing herself because she couldn't see any future for herself. My dad would just marry her to some garbage family as soon as my grandmother died, and she would be more like a commodity to be traded. On the 13th of June, 2008, my sister had a fight with my grandmother and was holding a little can of gasoline and saying that she was going to burn herself. My grandmother laughed and dared her to do it, which my sister did. My sister lived and died miserably. At first, my parents told me that it was an accident, but I overheard them talking about what happened in detail. By this point, my dad didn't even care. I was very disgusted with him and my mother. I dreamed a lot about just jumping on them and biting their effing throats off, and just watch them bleed in horror as I kicked their faces in. I wanted to hold his jaw from the inside with my hands and just rip it from his face. I eventually brooded and started going over the events. 3 guilty people, and I was planning on killing them all as violently as possible. I could never come up with a plan regarding my parents, but I was already done with how to end my grandmother, the filth who made life miserable for my sister. On December 2008, I booked a ticket to visit my grandmother and was supposed to return before New Year to celebrate with my friends. I told my parents that my friend is picking me up from the airport and I'm gonna stay with him for a few days before coming back. I then called my friend and told him that I'm going to passionately hug a girl that I met, and if my parents ever ask him about me, he would have to cover for me. Him, being oblivious to what I was actually doing, agreed. I flew to Syria and stayed with my grandmother for about 2 weeks. And when the day of my flight came, I packed my bags and told her that I'm going to the airport. With disgust, I kissed her goodbye and then made as much noise as possible with my bags to make sure that my nosy neighbors saw me leave for the airport. I even called a taxi driver that lived nearby and he took me directly to the airport. I made sure he saw me get into the airport. I then stood at the check-in and took a selfie. I didn't check in. I turned around and walked out. I took a cab to a nearby hotel and dropped my bag off in the room. I changed my clothes and then took a cab back to my grandmother's apartment. It was 2 at night and I was very quiet when I got up the stairs. I knocked on her door and she opened when she saw me through the peephole. She was surprised to see me and was wondering about the flight. I told her it was delayed for a few hours, so I left the bags at the check-in with the employees. She was tired, so she decided to make us some tea while I waited. As soon as she got up, I stood in front of her. She had this very confused look on her face due to my sudden reaction. I hadn't planned how to exactly do it, but I knew this is as good as it gets. Really quickly, I held her neck with my hands. My thumbs pressed on her throat very hard in case she tried to scream. She instantly got a horrified look on her face, and I just got really angry. She tried to speak, but couldn't make a single sound. At first, she tried hitting me, but my arms were longer than hers, and she couldn't reach me. When I started applying pressure, she tried to scratch my arms instead, but I was wearing a thick sweater and also I was being pumped with adrenaline. When I saw her strangling, I became very angry. I was grinding my teeth so hard I almost broke them. I told her, "This is for my sister." I kept repeating my sister's name in a quiet, angry tone, but she couldn't hear me. She was panicking and her only concern was getting air. She then kind of just froze there. I kept squeezing even though she didn't move. I really wanted to make sure. I finally let go after a while. My hands were cramped from all that tension, and I listened for a heartbeat. I then sat on the sofa, took a few breaths, and choked her again real hard for around 10 minutes. When I was sure she was dead, I started opening every drawer she had until I finally found her gold and money. I put them in a small bag and left. I closed the door behind me in case a neighbor found her early. I walked for nearly a whole hour while my hands were shaking like crazy. Until I was finally far away, I threw the bag with the money and gold in a small trash bucket that people had in front of their house. I went to take a taxi to the hotel and I remembered my sister and cried. I remembered my grandmother's face and I calmed down. I felt complete, like when a daunting task was finally over. A very soothing relief. That night, I slept like an effing baby. I woke up the next morning and bought breakfast and booked a ticket back to Sweden the same day. I turned the TV on and put on some music. For the first time after my sister's death, I was happy. When I came back to Sweden, I took the bus back from the airport and later took the train to my friend's house. I told him that the girl dumped me and I was instead celebrating with him. My dad calls me 2 days later and informs me that my grandmother was robbed and that the thief stole her valuables and killed her when she saw him. No one suspected an effing thing. I acted surprised and made my way back. For a few months, I acted sad and secretly watched my family in case someone got a wild theory, but they all seemed to believe the robbery part since it's not that uncommon. The closest someone got was my uncle when he mentioned how unfortunate it was that I left a day before this and that I could have saved her. My mother called it lucky because I nearly would have also gotten killed. I pretended to be sad about it. Now, every year, my dad makes a ceremony to kind of remember my grandmother. They make dinner for my family and friends and hope that the prayers reach her. They don't effing know that this is a time for celebration for me. I'm now married and I have 3 kids. The plan of killing my parents is canceled due to them screwing themselves over so bad that it's more of a punishment if they stay alive. They're also not allowed near my children, as a punishment to how they treated my sister. Every year, I celebrate this by buying gifts to my wife and kids. My wife wondered why I did this, and I simply said that the way my grandmother passed made me realize how suddenly loved ones can disappear, and how this is my way of saying I love you. OP has an annual celebration of the time he murdered his grandmother. This guy is cold as ice. Our next Reddit post is from Layla Annis. My parents divorced when I was in first grade. Not only did my dad disappear like Houdini, he stole my mother's ATM card to her personal account and drained her dry. My mother, being the saint she is, didn't even bat an eye. She still was cordial to him and never said a negative word about him. To me, my dad, albeit abandoning us, was still my hero. From 1st through 5th grade, I had the usual abandoned by dad stories. Maybe 1 or 2 visits in a year, and 50 times of me waiting by the front window with my suitcase packed to go to his house and him never showing up. My mom, through all of this, was supportive and never said an ill word about him. So he still stayed my hero. When I was in 6th grade, my mother finally remarried, and my father, who only had a picture of me at 8 months old in his wallet, went ballistic. Did I mention he never paid child support? He would use his father's social, they had the same name, to get away with it. After my mom remarried, he let it be known that I was now my stepdad's responsibility. He cut off communication with me until I graduated high school. He didn't attend my graduation or send me a card. What he did do was write me an email thanking God he no longer had to pay child support. He didn't anyway. What really broke me was his ruthless and brutal attack on my mother, attacking her weight, looks, teeth, and blaming any perceived negative traits that I had on her. For the first time, I realized what a cowardly piece of garbage he was. I responded in kind. He told me that I was no child of his and that I was a waste. After that, I vowed that I would hurt him. 10 years later, my father, not interested in my wedding or my son, reached out to me. You see, he is a diabetic, and one of his organs was failing and he didn't have long. He is far down on the list and he needed someone in our family to donate. Nuclearrevenge activated. I answered his email. I met up with him and pretended that I didn't hate his guts. I went and got tested to see if I was a match. I was. I did the therapy and met with the doctors and his therapist. We scheduled the surgery. The day of the surgery, we met at the hospital. I smiled in his face and let him know that I wouldn't be going through with the surgery. I watched the confusion line his face. And I said, I just wanted you to know that you're no father to me and you're a waste. I left the hospital and drove home. My mom was pretty annoyed with me that I took it that far. My father is dying and I will be attending the funeral out of spite. And I will let everyone know what a piece of garbage he was. Edit, this really blew up. For those questioning my actions, I'll give further detail. My father was semi-obsessed with my mother. His attachment to us was only in his perceived ability to get back with my mother. In the beginning, he would call and make plans to see us, and just not show up. My mom would have to make up excuses. He's been married over 4 times and supports and loves his stepkids without a thought to us. Once my mother remarried, he was done with us. He kept in contact with my mother through email, but had no interest in talking to his children. I've reached out to him before, to invite him to my graduation, to let him know of my marriage, and that he was a grandfather. All I got back was pictures of his new wife's kids. Upon getting to know him after agreeing to donate, I went to one of his therapy sessions at his request. There, I heard the story of the true reason he contacted me. I listened as he lamented about his impending death, how he was resigned to his fate, only to have his new wife remind him of his former kids, and maybe one of them will donate. And he got excited because he had forgotten all about us, and it was like hope renewed. Do you know how sucky it is to listen to the person who is responsible for your very existence talk about forgetting your very existence? Like I was a pair of sturdy old boots that gathered dust in the back of the hall closet. Now rediscovered, I was to be worn to go shovel manure. I knew then I wasn't going to give him anything. OP literally left her dad to die. That's like watching someone dangle from the edge of a cliff and be like, see ya, wouldn't wanna be ya. That was rSlash Nuclearrevenge, and my puppy Yugo is very protective of me. So you had better check out my new Yugo plushie on my merch store, otherwise he might just get Nuclearrevenge against you.